Yeah, we do see it as part, and we think that we have to have a very holistic perspective on circular economy, and I think sourcing has a lot to do with that, because of course we haven't talked too much about recycling yet, and normally circular economy is very much associated to recycling, and of course we understand that, but recycling has limitations in terms of how much you can actually achieve in recycling. So as population is growing, as middle class is growing, as developing world is bringing so many billion people, as Richard was saying, to the consumption world, we have to understand where the sourcing is so that the economy can actually work circularly, because otherwise we end up having a lack of resources in one way or the other. So I think it's something that has to be really an holistic perspective to it. You know, it's the sourcing, it's how it's used. So you have to look at the conditions about the sourcing, the conditions about the production. You have to look at the alternative materials, alternative options that you have that could be showing a lighter footprint in terms of resources. And then of course recycling comes at the end to make sure that the materials are available again for production, for use.
But you mentioned before that you got your alternatives using ethanol, I think, for plastic.
Yeah.
But I mean, realistically, you're making, as you said, billions of cartons. You're still going to be using a lot of fossil fuels, realistically, aren't you? So can you ever really tackle that aspect of your business?
Yeah, and fossil fuels, in the sense of the polymers we use, we are a very small buyer of fossil fuels in that sense. So how much can we influence as a company is also very limited. But when we look at biopolymers, actually it's a new material, it's early days, and there we think we can influence, being one of the first ones starting to work with it. And there again, we are looking at certification for the raw material. You know, WWF supports the Bom Sucro label for sugar that has been developed in the last few years. It's still very early days. One thing we have to consider about standards, certification standards, those that are really independent, they normally are small institutions that strive to keep on alive and keep on working, even if the exposure they have sometimes is really great. So we're looking at how to make the sourcing of these materials we're using for the biopolymer sustainable in the very long run, very long time. And
Jan Willem, maybe you can ask the same question about the circular economy.
Yeah. Well, we are with Tetra Pak on, let's say, how to further develop, let's say, the initiatives in the circular economy. With regard to packaging material. On top of that, I think there's also this whole waste area where more can be done. I mean, reuse and also have the energy use. We're not there yet. I mean, a lot of good programs, but if you actually see what is happening around the world in this area, then much more needs to be done also in that area and can be done. And using residues and waste for energy purposes, for example, is one of the alternatives there. And it's much better to use these, let's say, residues and waste material instead of using food as biofuel, for example. So if we want to support, let's say, sustainable use of raw material, then we should also consider, let's say, the actual use of food and feed for biofuels, which in fact does not help if you want to set up a sustainable circular economy.
So going back to the sustainable sourcing, I mean, and we talked about the influence of big companies like yours. What about small companies? Do they really need help from the European Commission, for instance? Do we need to have some overarching standards that will help everybody? Or can your certification schemes or the power of companies like yours sort of, you know, plow the way for the small companies to follow in your wake?
Well, the example before, let's say we started this morning, I said, well, smallholders in developing countries, there's a lot we can do and help them with. And we know DG DEFCO has now communicated a program for the period 2014-2020, there is 3.5 billion euros in that program in order to work with the private sector in developing countries, supporting smallholders for specific projects which are also of interest, of course, for Europe with regard to the supply of raw materials.
So they're the suppliers you're talking
Yeah,
about, yeah.
and so small companies, SME companies, let's say, in these developing countries, they need help. They need help from us. They need help from their local entities in order to produce in a sustainable way, in order to improve their businesses so that they can, let's say, also, let's say, thrive and flourish in let's say, in the years to come, certainly. And I think together we can do a lot for smallholders in that context. Within the European Union, we know that we have a large budget to help also primary agricultural producers. So a large budget. So we do provide a lot of help within the European Union. And I would say also there that if you hand out the money, make sure that the production is done in a sustainable way. Not for a part or a portion, but entirely. And I think that is the challenge we also face internally.
Mm-hmm. Richard, you wanted to come in?
Yeah. I think you just started to talk about it now, William. I mean, the key thing is trying to get the sustainability in these supply chains to scale. And I think that's actually what we're grappling with here.
Yes, yes.
I mean, whether you're if you're a small company, the costs associated with knowing about all of your full supply chain are going to be much larger, relatively speaking, than it is for a company of the scale of Unilever. So there is a need for the large companies to actually do a lot of the heavy lifting to get us up to a scale where it becomes much more the norm in terms of production. And then we're talking about not the 10% of production and buying, but then we're up in the 30, 40, 50% level, at which point for small and medium companies it will be just as easy. It will be as easy as putting a cross on a form to get that. And that's really one of the key things. So, and that's where, I mean, if we take the key challenge is getting to scale, well, it's not just large companies, of course. Then we have the role of government coming in as well. We need to think of what are the tools that we can apply to get to scale with embedded sustainability in it as fast as possible. And there I think the entry of governments and the European Union into this would be extremely helpful and positive. The question is exactly how to do it in a way which helps rather than gets in the way.
So what do you think could help and not get in the way in terms of government or EU help?
I think I suppose one of the obvious places to start for all governments, whether it's at European level or at national, is to look at what governments themselves buy. I mean, it's a very obvious thing. We're talking to companies about what they buy. The same principles and standards and practices should apply to government buying. I was just one very mini example from the Netherlands. I just happened to be talking about it the other day. If you look at tropical wood import into the Netherlands, it's not massive on a global scale, but it's coming from areas where there are rather suspect both social and environmental practices. I won't name all the countries for you. But actually the largest single user of that wood are the water authorities. They're public institutions, not private. So if you actually work on the policies and practices of some of the public institutions in terms of tropical wood sourcing in the Netherlands, you actually get further than you do working with all of the DIY chains put together. So I think let's not forget that. I mean, so that's if you like, that's a very obvious one with a read across from everything that's been learned from companies. I think the second key thing which governments and I would hope also the European Commission can do is to drive transparency. I think actually one of the big barriers to getting more sustainable and getting to scale is just nobody knows. It's the problem little companies will have, small, medium. It's a problem even for big companies. And I think the sort of things which were mentioned about the accounting directive about, forcing companies to publish, well, actually we need to find ways of getting information about from source to end use into the public domain. And I see a very strong role. I see that also really as a regulatory role to actually make that, to set the absolute minimum. And I would expect companies like Tetra Pak and Unilever to be, way beyond that, of course.
But
so that's two sort of key things I think I would like to see.
You're talking about setting minimum standards, But isn't there almost a danger in that then people will just hide behind those and not actually have the ambition to go further?
There is always that danger, and I think that's where you also have the role of NGOs. So part of our job, I suppose, not just WWF, but also the whole range of colleagues who work in, whether it's for social, human rights, environment and development, is our sort of watchdog function to try to make clear to not just these companies, but to society in general in terms of something which is claimed as sustainable but is only legal. And then what are the steps that need to be made to get there? So, I mean, I'm not sure you can legislate for that, but I think be very clear about definitions so that we don't confuse legality with sustainability, and that we have some sort of step ladder from a minimum legal requirement which everybody has to meet, and some sort of continuous improvement from that, which if somebody can tell me how to put that into legislation, I would love to lobby for it.
Willem-Jan, would you welcome that more involvement at government or EU level, or do you think it really is something that is happening anyway through the private sector?
Yeah, well, I think that first of all, we take our responsibility in the private sector, and we continue to work on it. We call out, let's say, for that, our colleagues, our partners, suppliers, and the NGOs. And on the NGO side, let me say that if you want to work with the best experts in sustainable sourcing, then most often you'll find them in the NGOs. People are real experts. They are dedicated. They know how to deal with the issues you're confronted with. And the issues are, let's say, sometimes smaller, but sometimes bigger. So there is a lot of work to do. On partnerships, we need to further develop our work. But on governments, I mean, if only governments would have, let's say, appropriate legislation in place, let's say, in several areas, it will be a tremendous help. I mean, I mean, here in the EU, we're saying on nitrate and water, for example, the use of pesticide, herbicides, and so on. So it's a help. So in third countries where this legislation is not there yet, then we need to work our way through to make sure that we, let's say, have the floor, the minimum standards, if you like, in place. But on top of that, you need also progressive forces. People who say that sourcing, let's say, has to take into account the elimination of deforestation. So, and for that, you need active, let's say, combinations of private sector and governments and local governments to say, well, wait a minute, we don't enter into the forest in this area. Yes, we definitely need to work with governments, and I think that we've made progress already here in the EU, but also the challenge is to work with local governments in the countries where we also source in, let's say, in the developing countries, basically.
Do you have I want to come to John in a minute, but Mario, do you have
I just want to offer something regarding the small and micro enterprise as well, is that we're talking about certification, and these standards actually are a very good opportunity to bring the small and micro enterprise into sourcing, because normally when it comes to large mining operations, large refining operations, you're talking about very large groups that have that right. When it comes to palm oil, when it comes to forestry, normally the resources are coming from thousands and thousands of smallholders. And if we want to have responsible sourcing, you want to know who these smallholders are, you want to know where your materials are coming from, and that's a very important role the certifications play, because then they allow a smallholder who is not known, doesn't have a brand, doesn't have, a history, to actually comply with something, be audited, and be part of that value chain. WWF has a number of programs. Tetra Pak partners with WWF in some of them to actually empower the local smallholders to understand what they need to do to achieve certification. because very often they don't even have access to what the standard requires from them. So we try to bring this. We have had programs together in China. We have a program nowadays in Peru, trying to bring smallholders into being part of the economy, and that is really a great chance for empowerment for them.
Mm-hmm. So John, how do you see the potential role, if we're talking about trying to mainstream this concept? What's the role of the Commission potentially?
Well, I think one has been mentioned, which is the public procurement, and I think there have been discussions on that in this week. It used to be the case that when in the public authority had to choose the cheapest bid, full stop. But now, through a combination of legislation, but also rulings of the European Court of Justice, the principle has been accepted that they can have a more expensive bid, but if it has better environmental properties. So that's an important flexibility that that authorities have who are purchasing. So that's governments acting as a consumer rather than as a regulator.
Yeah.
In terms of regulation, I think it's still, for me, I don't think it's still a debate on what is the most appropriate role of government, and whether to have horizontal instruments, whether to have. I think the bilateral approach of working with specific countries certainly allows for more interaction. And then we have the development policy as well, where agriculture is going to be a main priority in the next 7 years for the EU development policy. I think coming on the development issue, this issue of smallholders, what is the impact on the small guys, is one we have to be conscious about, because there is a risk that the bigger farms have, sometimes it's even a question of language, that they know how to interact with the buyers, they know what they need and so on. So there is a risk that by setting standards in a way which the small guys can't access, then it's not good for our overall objective. So we need to think about that, about how to build in programs from the beginning to take that into account. But another issue I've been wondering about is if we're going to have a proliferation of schemes for different commodities, then ultimately you could have a farmer being visited by 4 different auditors for 4 different products and so on. And so there is some thinking also in relation to deforestation of whether you shouldn't be looking at sort of area-based certification to say that a certain area is being managed sustainably and all the products coming from that area, whether they be trees or different agricultural crops, could be considered sustainable.
Which goes back to Richard's point of sort of mergers and acquisitions of certification schemes. Gentleman from Maastricht.
A piece of information to share. I'm glad to mention it because it's always interesting to see what science has to contribute. It is about support for certification, and it is about a global atlas of environmental conflicts. It is an initiative in the sense of environmental justice, and the website is ejatlas.org, sponsored by the European Union. And it reveals the link between production processes and consequences on the ground in terms of lost livelihoods, damage to nature, health, and even loss of lives. And I think there is a great potential as an interactive web-based tool to have a broad application to inform certification schemes. And since it is about environmental justice, the Aarhus Convention that applies to Europe is also attracting attention politically in Latin America. And Latin America is working on the option to consider to adopt the scheme. So I think potential is great. It could be driven by legal reform, but I think all actors, government or otherwise, would find their interest to connect to social movements in the countries where the goods are coming from. I just wanted to stress this item, and in generally, science has a lot to offer to the debate.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for that point. Could you pass the microphone to your part?
Good morning, everybody. My name is Vinciane Patlou, working for Cabinet DN Consulting, representing Starbucks Coffee. I have a question about the third countries, because we talked about them as producing countries, but they are also consuming goods. So you were saying that for palm oil, the demand is not there, the production is there, but not the demand. What can be done to drive the demand also from growing economies like China, India, and make sure that they also are demanding products that are sustainably sourced?
That's a very good point, isn't it? Because it's whether we're talking about Europe or we're looking at the time.
How long have you got? I mean, that's an incredibly important and also an enormous question. Pick on one example. If you take the example of China and consumption in China, obviously it's going to be one of the defining challenges, I think, not just for the Chinese, but also for the rest of us. If you want to introduce sustainability in whatever shape or form into China, there are two key things. One is health. The thing which is really driving behavior in China at the moment is fear about the security of product. If we can build in sustainability into food safety standards in China, I think we're getting somewhere. And of course, in China, if you want to make anything work, you're going to have to do it with the government as well. So there's going to be a new blend of private-public sort of partnership in that type of country. The second thing you mentioned about basically domestic production, I think is another enormous challenge. If we take Brazil, I mean, Brazil is not just the largest coffee producer, they're also the largest coffee consumer. So actually thinking through how to make these type of systems, which have been designed actually very honestly for sort of an international trade and developed Western markets, we are going to have to innovate and change these so that they work for the average consumer in Brazil or in Indonesia. And that's going to be different and it's going to be difficult.
Willem-Jan.
The major markets, let's say, are outside Europe, basically, if you take population growth potential. So we have to take that into account. And I think there is let's say, a trend now that developed countries, they more and more, let's say, are let's say, building up on sustainability requirements. We also see that large retailers like Walmart, for example, has a sophisticated program, let's say, on sustainability, where we also participate. So that's at global level. So you see Consumer Goods Forum retailers, let's say, at the international level, working, let's say, in this area. For domestic use in India and China, more is needed. More is needed. And then the three pillars of sustainability come, let's say, to the fore again. It's about economic, social, and environment. And it requires collaboration with the local governments, with the players on the ground. But in the end of the day, we are convinced that in the coming years, 2020, 2030, 2050, that also we need adequate sustainability programs in these countries with these major populations, if only for their own, let's say, better livelihoods on social environment and therefore also on the economic terms. And that's the challenge ahead of us.
Right, we are coming towards an end. I'm sorry we haven't got to all the questions, but just to round up very quickly, I wonder whether I could ask you all in just about 45 seconds what you think would be a real boost to mainstreaming sustainable sourcing. So we go back to the the 100% sustainable sourcing. How do we get there? What would be the real priority action that could make it happen? So maybe I could start with you, Mario.
I think I would go to what the question coming from Tony Long. I think it is about creating the level playing field where the responsibility is attributed to all the players, be it the government, be it the economic players. Responsibility should be there, understand what we're sourcing, where we're sourcing from, and taking ownership and responsibility for that.
And Jan Willem. I'll come back to John because John obviously has a different perspective from this.
Well, I would say in general, awareness and transparency. Awareness and transparency. I think what we've seen on sustainability is that 20 years ago, 15 years ago, it was difficult to sell the sustainability concept. Now we have sustainability included, let's say, sustainability impact assessments. The EU Commission is used to that. We've gone through that learning curve, so to say. But awareness, let's say mainstream awareness with the public, with consumers, is of critical importance, because if we don't have the consumers and the customers in the boat, then it will be much more difficult. And then transparency is something where I think today people do expect, let's say, the private sector and the public sector to be transparent, do provide information on the sourcing and the sustainable sourcing. And we as a company, Unilever, we are transparent, we believe. We have documentation available. It's here, it's also on our website. And I do invite you to comment and to even help us to improve our, let's say, communication.
Richard from WWF.
I think with regard to sustainable sourcing, we've heard from a couple of companies here. I think when we actually talk to the business sector in general, it's no more excuses. There is a way to do this. The experience is there, the product is there, go and buy it. And actually get on with the business of actually making sustainable sourcing a reality. I think what Willem already mentioned is really important in terms of transparency, being clear about it, publishing it, making it actually the information about what a company is doing available. I think the key thing which we've talked about here, or one of the key things coming out of here, is how to upscale. And I think we need sector agreements to actually get beyond individual companies. And we need actually governments to get involved. Last year, Ireland actually, of all countries, broke the mold and actually declared, or the Minister of Agriculture declared, that all of their agricultural exports will be sustainable by 2020. First country in the world to do that, as far as I'm aware. If there are others, my apologies to them. We need, as we mentioned, we need government. There needs to be involvement in the positive sense like that. There needs to be help in terms of making things, making transparency work, and there has to be a credible threat of legislation coming down the pipeline if the private sector doesn't step up and take it and do its job.
So a credible threat of legislation, John, where do you you've only got 45 seconds, remember?
Yeah, I have to be careful what I say here. In recent years, we've had EU legislation on illegal on fish. So basically, prohibiting the sale in the EU of fish that hasn't been met the requirements of regional fisheries management organisations and national fish in waters of the countries. Of any country, yeah. Basically. So also on timber, we've had this timber regulation, which is also about legality of timber. And recently there's been a proposal about conflict minerals, so coming from areas of
So you're saying
conflict.
there could be more threats of legislation?
But of course, this is about legality, which can be defined according to a country. You know, there's some standards in the country of origin. When it comes to sustainability, lawyers get a lot more nervous because it's a fuzzy. It's not that well defined, and it can be used in the wrong way. So it can be used as a way of protectionist agenda, depending on how you set it. So I think, bearing in mind, there's now a proliferation, I would say, of different sustainability schemes. I mean, it's not just for different commodities. Perhaps a useful step forward would be to establish some common principles in terms of across different commodities. For what could be some principles of sustainability, which would cover substance but also process, bearing in mind what we said about the need to adjust the sustainability standards to context.
And you would agree, though, that it is urgent, that I mean, resource efficiency and resources are under threat in the world.
Well, it's urgent, but we need to. As was mentioned, we have big markets in Asia. We can't plow ahead and think that we'll solve the problem if we're not also engaging with consumers and companies in Asia and other emerging economies. And we also need to, there can be a reaction that we're imposing requirements on other countries and then countries get very defensive. So it has to be developed in partnership with them rather than seen as a sort of barrier for them.
Okay. I'm sure we could have gone on, and I'm sorry if we didn't get to all the questions, but thank you very much indeed to our panelists for some really nice insight into this issue, which will continue, no doubt, in the corridors afterwards. But thank you very much indeed.